He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
They decided to go to investigate, and they opened up, and what they saw was something that they would never forget. In fact, when the police were called, again they'd come across something that they'd never seen before and stayed with them for the rest of their lives.
In 1960, the police found the body of a man in a central Auckland apartment. He had died from self-castration. But the real mystery is what happened to his wife, Cynthia Grierson Jackson. I'm Jesse Mulligan, and this is Crimes NZ. In this episode, I'm joined by true crime writer Scott Bainbridge, author of the book Without a Trace, On the Trail of New Zealand Missing Persons.
Talking about sort of high-profile cases, and this case isn't really well remembered today, but certainly back in 1960 it was all over the news. So this couple hadn't been in New Zealand for too long. So Michael Grierson Jackson was an ex-RAF fighter pilot during the war, and after the war he served time in the Royal Canadian Air Force as well as the Australian Air Force. So he was highly qualified, and sometime during his travels around the world, he met Cynthia, who was the daughter of a French father and an English mother she'd pretty much been born and raised in India all her life, and she could speak Indian and French and English quite fluently. And so they married and immigrated to New Zealand in August of 1959. They travelled all around the country because Mike's work took him all over the show, really. He secured a job for Rudnick Helicopters as a top-dressing helicopter pilot. So he was, his work was in demand, and so they initially settled in Whanganui before moving to the Mount, and then up. A lot of his work was South Auckland, so they moved sort of late 1959, early 1960 up to Auckland and then secured an apartment in Park Road in Grafton.
What sort of relationship did they have?
Well, the few people that I talked to that do remember them as being, a very stylish couple. Now, Cynthia was a dressmaker and a designer, and so this couple turned heads wherever they went. One woman that I talked to remembered Cynthia as emulating Jackie Kennedy. The Kennedys were in the White House at that stage, so she's Cynthia was well remembered for having the stylish haircuts and the big sunglasses like Jackie Kennedy had. To their friends, they appeared outwardly they appeared to be happy, but certainly later on, after the events happened, it was learnt that there was a bit of domestic abuse happening. Cynthia had recorded it in her diary, so that was a fair bit of unhappiness there. One of Cynthia's friends did recall that Mike fancied himself as a bit of a ladies' man and may have had some affairs, during the time. But certainly, from what I understand, the move to Auckland was to start afresh. And the people in the neighbouring apartments in Grafton certainly didn't think anything there was untoward, except for a couple of days prior to the discovery of Mike's body. Loud voices had been heard late at night, but then nothing else after that.
Okay. Also, possibly important to the story is an accident that Mike had, and it was in a helicopter, wasn't it?
Yeah, later on, when it was determined the circumstances around his death, there was question there as to what his state of mind was. Now, 2 months after they arrived in New Zealand, Mike was doing some work in the Tuakau area, top dressing, and there was an engine malfunction in a small helicopter and it crashed. And although there were he wasn't badly injured, there was some thought that he may have sustained some sort of head injury which caused perhaps his personality to change. Certainly his helicopter partner or the chap that helped him with loading the helicopter, Noel War, who I did track down, he recalled the helicopter crash very clearly, but he didn't think that Mike was badly affected, apart from being shaken after the crash and in the few days afterwards. He didn't think that it affected him mentally.
So what happened in the lead up to her disappearance?
Well, this is the thing we don't know. They'd moved to Park Road, and by all intents and purposes, they'd been seen together and were in happy spirits apart from this argument late one night. Now, no one saw or heard any movement out of that apartment after that argument. But the landlord, who lived reasonably close by, was contacted by one of the neighbours to say that the outside light had been basically switched on for a couple of days, and there'd been no movement in and around the house, or the flat. So they decided to go to investigate, and they opened up. And what they saw was something that they would never forget. In fact, when the police were called, again they'd come across something that they'd never seen before and stayed with them for the rest of their lives. And it was basically the small flat was in a reasonably tidy condition except for the bedroom. The bedroom resembled like an amateur science lab. There were beakers and bottles and flagons containing all sorts of mixtures, which were later identified as glycerine, cyanide. There was a flagon of sherry, other liquors as well. But it was what was on the bed, and it was so Mike's dead body was on the bed, naked, and there was a surgeon's scalpel on the floor, lots of blood-covered newspapers, and yes, he had been castrated, and it was later determined the cause of death was shock, following the loss of blood. The police initially thought that there was it was a murder, but that was quickly ruled out because the doors had been locked from the inside, so they quickly determined that he inflicted that horrific injury on himself. Now, a couple of days before he died, he had been seen in a sort of state of, or how should we say it, perhaps drunkenness. He did actually go to his wife's workplace. She was working in a sewing shop, and he returned some of her work smocks, and her workmates believed that he probably had been drunk, and he basically said that Pat had left him. And she'd run off to the South Island. So when the investigation kicked off after the body was found, the police made a big attempt to try and track her down by contacting all of the police stations around the country to see if anybody of her description had turned up. There was a suitcase found in the room with all of many of Pat's dresses all folded up.
Just to jump in, by the way, Cynthia, she was sometimes called Pat. So
sorry.
So sometimes we'll call her Cynthia and sometimes we'll call her Pat. But,
we'll try and call her Cynthia, yeah.
Yeah, same person.
Yeah. So some Cynthia's smocks and dresses were folded up in the suitcase in newspapers, and it was newspapers of the days leading up to the discovery of the body. So it looked like they'd been hastily packed, and there was some evidence of blood found on some of the dresses, which they determined didn't belong to Mike. But because the couple hadn't been in the country for very long, they didn't know, and we're talking about 1960, so they didn't have Cynthia's blood type. But there wasn't enough blood on those dresses to determine whether or not she was alive or dead.
So, do we think that he was telling the truth when he turned up to her work and reported to them that she had left and headed to the South Island?
Well, that was the only feasible explanation, really. There was no evidence to suggest that he had done anything. His neighbours, when they were interviewed, said that he exchanged pleasantries with them. There was certainly nothing untoward there in the days before he died. But there was certainly nothing in his demeanour or his character to suggest that he'd done anything horrific to her.
So what do we think happened to her?
Well, for months and months, and if we go, I know one of your previous guests talked about the Truth newspaper as being, far from the truth. But I went back to some of these papers like the Truth and the Herald, and they for weeks and weeks they did a great big coverage of trying to track Cynthia down, and were quite open with what actually happened, or the scene of the death. So there was a great big media call for her. She obviously had been well travelled, so there was some thought that she may have engineered her own might have disappeared herself, voluntary. She might have left the country back in 1960. It was reasonably easy to travel, overseas without a passport. Her passport was, I believe, it was found, but she may have. It was understood that she probably had the nous to get up and go if she wanted to.
Was there a sighting in the South Island?
Oh, look, there were a number of sightings, throughout the country, and because she was the way she was, she described as dressing quite stylishly and a very attractive woman. People tended to take notice, and but a lot of the sightings were followed up, but either disproved or they couldn't track down, or they couldn't find that person that the person had sighted.
You, Scott, recently received a coronial report into the death of Mike. Did it have anything of interest in there?
Not that I haven't mentioned. In fact, there wasn't anything other than the neighbours and people that had seen Michael in the days leading up to his death say anything other than that he seemed to be okay. The coronial inquest closed without any reference to Cynthia at all, because at that stage, it was still thought that she was. That she was somewhere either in the country or out of the country. There certainly wasn't any indication that she was dead.
Okay, then there's another twist to the story. So at the moment, the best guess is that she has willingly disappeared for whatever reason. But then we go back to the North Waikato, where two farmers find a leg. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, this adds some even more bizarre play to the story. But in August of 1960, two farmers in Tauranga, they were which is near the Waikato Heads near Waiuku. They were contemplating an afternoon of fishing, and but it was too rough. And as they were walking upstream, they came across what they thought was a human leg washed up on the banks, and they didn't think too much of it. But they went back and at a party that night, or a few nights later, they
didn't think too much of it. A human leg on the bank.
Yeah. Well, look. There had been a lot, when I was doing the research to the story, I do recall that, in the months leading up to, and totally unrelated, but, there would be the odd piece of human body sort of found in the Waikato River that, the police could, check back, and it was, from the hospital or, human remains. And there's some examples there of human remains not being sort of taken totally care of. So they did, occasionally end up in the river. But yeah, these farmers, I guess they had fishing on their mind and didn't think too much, or forgot about it until a few nights later when it came up in conversation, and the local constable overheard and said, well, heck, we better go back and have a look. And sure enough, they found it, and it was a leg virtually intact, so it was cut off at the hip joint, with a very sharp instrument, as if it was a surgical scalpel. And it was reasonably well preserved as well. I mean, even though it had been there some period of time, the leg was sort of complete to the hip joint, and the pieces of flesh above the knee had already sort of peeled off. And it was only in its early stages of decomposition, but the specialists considered that they figured that the leg had been severed from the body after death and around 13 weeks previously, and they believed that the leg belonged to a woman aged sort of between 18 and 30 years of age, whose height would have been about 5'2". So the police narrowed it down to, only a fair few, but Cynthia's name was certainly top of the list. But the problem there was that, Cynthia was 37, so was out of that date range, and also she was 5'4", not 5'2". So, she was initially discounted, but there was another missing girl who fitted into that range of being 5'2", and had disappeared sort of between 12 weeks earlier, that was still regarded as missing.
Okay, so maybe more likely that it was her. And in fact, when police start looking at that one, they get caught up in another crime, the disappearance of Lynette White, who was due to testify against a salesman called Ivan Sund.
That's right, yeah. So Lynette had been listed as missing, and in early May, she was actually due to give evidence at a court case of this chap called Ivan Sund. About less than 10 years ago, I wrote a book called The Bassett Road Machine Gun Murders about the Auckland gangland of the early 60s. And I kept coming across the name of Ivan Sund. He kept appearing. So, one thing I learnt about him is he was a pretty much a low level. I wouldn't say he was in the upper echelons of the Auckland underworld, but certainly he had a finger in a lot of pies, and he was associated with George Walker, Big George, who was one of the victims of the Bassett Road murders, and he certainly at one stage he operated a legal beer house, in the era of 6 o'clock closing. So he associated with I guess the rougher element of the time. Mr. Sund operated a 1960 backstreet abortion service, which was illegal back then, and so Lynette got caught up in that. She was just a young girl from Whitianga. She'd got a job as a law clerk up in Auckland, and for whatever happened, she learnt about what Mr. Sund was doing, and had agreed to police that she would give evidence against him, and he was arrested and due to give evidence in court, but Lynette didn't turn up and she wasn't found, and so nobody really knew where she was, and her own family were keeping pretty quiet about it as well. But there was some thought there after the leg was found that hey, maybe the underworld had gotten hold of Lynette, and maybe she was the victim and she'd been cut up.
Okay. And back to Cynthia Grierson Jackson, what do you think happened to her?
Look, I think she was never. There's been no sighting or no trace of her at all. I certainly believe that the leg likely did belong to Cynthia.
You do?
Yeah. I do. I'm going to explain why, and that's that I did manage to find out what actually did happen to Lynette. Even though she was missing, I did manage to track down that she was alive, so it couldn't have been her.
You've been listening to Crimes NZ with me, Jesse Mulligan. You can catch more of me Monday to Friday hosting RNZ's Afternoons show, and you can find more episodes of Crimes NZ on the RNZ podcasts page. It's also on Apple, Spotify, iHeart, or wherever you catch your favourite podcasts. Remember to follow this series so you don't miss an episode, and check out some of RNZ's other podcasts while you're there, like Our Changing World, our science podcast. Or you can listen live to shows like this and much more with me on RNZ's Afternoons program, 1 to 4 p.m. on RNZ National.